Section 23 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmund Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 18. The Dutch Republic before the War. The Republic had risen with remarkable elasticity from the exhaustion of the late war. A national debt of 12.5 millions sterling was borne with ease. Her population was rapidly increasing, her commerce was expanding in every quarter of the globe, and her traders were displaying their former exclusiveness. But this absorption in the search for wealth, and their apparent immunity from foreign invasion, forbade in her people that spirit of watchfulness and that readiness to sink individual interests in the national welfare which result from the constant imminence of danger. The character of the Dutch, said De Witt, is such that they will take no steps for defence until the danger stares them in the face. With all this apparent prosperity, there existed in the claims of the Prince of Orange an abiding source of political instability. De Witt had indeed secured the charge of his education as a ward of the state, and was sedulously training him, as Mazarin trained Louis, to be fit to govern. The Perpetual Edict of January 1668 and the Act of Harmony which followed had secured the separation of the civil and military commands, for the Stadtholderate was abolished in Holland, while in the other provinces it was rendered incompatible with the offices of Captain or Admiral General of the Republic, offices which the Prince was to occupy only when he reached the age of 22. With the sympathy, however, of both Louis and Charles, he soon began to act for himself. Escaping in September 1668 from De Witt's surveillance, he hastened to Zeeland, where his party was strong, and was received with enthusiasm. In 1670 De Witt was compelled to assent to his taking his seat on the Council of State, and to his visiting England. As war grew imminent, his claims became more acceptable. The past was forgotten, except that under the leadership of his house independence had been won. The army and navy were enthusiastic in his favour. In the spring of 1672, after taking an oath to maintain the Perpetual Edict, and with many limitations, he was made Captain General for one campaign, the office to be continued for life should it seem fitting when he had completed his 22nd year. The Admiralty, so long as Ruyter was there to lead the fleet, was held in reserve. De Witt offered a signal example of the truth of his own saying. He could not bring himself to believe that his work was so soon to perish, though mysterious warnings had reached him as early as February 1668. When, however, his offers to assist Louis in his eventual designs upon Spain, and to settle the Spanish Low Countries favourably to French interests, were slightingly passed by, and a complimentary address from the States General to Louis in Flanders in the spring of 1671 was received with studied coldness. When Louis refused to include the Republic in the arbitration concerning his alleged infractions of the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle, when the French ambassador was removed from The Hague and no successor sent, when heavy duties were imposed upon Dutch goods entering France, and all attempts at retaliation treated with contempt, the truth came upon him with terrible clearness. In January 1672, he made a final appeal to Louis, offering to disarm completely if he would do the same and would remove the hostile tariffs. Louis replied that he should complete his preparations and should use his forces as best befitted his dignity. The awakening to the treachery of Charles had been still slower and more painful. Here, too, he had tried every means of conciliation. Hearing of the king's irritation at the pamphlets, medals, and triumphal pictures which glorified the Chatham achievement, and especially that the captured Royal Charles was made a common show, he had the moulds of the medals broken, the pamphlets as far as possible suppressed, the royal arms removed from the vessel and her name altered, concessions which were viewed merely as signs of weakness. The recall of Temple in July 1671 was made the occasion for a wanton insult to the Dutch. The captain of the yacht sent to bring back Lady Temple was ordered by Charles to sail through their fleet in the Channel, to insist upon their lowering their flags, and in case of refusal to take such action as would compel them to fire upon him and so appear the aggressors, a scheme frustrated only by the self-restraint of the Dutch admiral, Van Ghent. In December, Downing, a well-known enemy of the Republic, was sent to succeed Temple as ambassador to The Hague, with instructions to bring about a rupture. In the most offensive terms he demanded reparation for the insults of which Charles complained, and specifically insisted upon the acknowledgment of the maritime supremacy of England over all seas, going so far as to require that whole fleets should lower their flags to a single English warship. Even to this outrageous demand De Witt was willing to give way, provided the king would engage to assist the Republic against France. As late as March 3rd, 1672, he endeavoured to conjure away the danger by the offer of a heavy personal bribe to Charles. Charles had wished to appear as the attacked party. When he found the attempt useless, he began hostilities by an act which Louis himself contemptuously characterized as sheer piracy. The Dutch merchant fleet from Smyrna was lying at anchor off the Isle of Wight. Admiral Holmes was ordered to attack without warning and to capture the convoy. But the Dutch were prepared, and after a severe engagement, March 13th, the fleet escaped with the loss of only 2 vessels. War was declared by England 4 days later. As danger approached, the Dutch had done their best to secure allies, but their proverbial thriftiness stood much in their way. They might undoubtedly have anticipated France in securing Sweden had they been as open-handed as Louis. Only in 2 quarters did they gain any important success. The Grand Elector of Brandenburg, the most powerful of the German princes, had been induced, through his vehement Protestantism and his jealousy of the proximity of French troops, to sign a treaty in February 1671, which became effectual in April 1672, when he promised to aid the Republic with 22,000 men, and his adhesion brought with it that of the Elector of Mayence. Spain, too, convinced that if the United Provinces fell into the hands of Louis nothing could save her Low Countries, concluded with the Dutch a treaty of mutual defence. But even so, the case of the Republic seemed desperate against the forces which Louis was prepared to launch upon her. The retrenchment of expenses after the peace had been unwisely made upon the army. No less than 41,000 men had then been disbanded. Obligatory service had become a dead letter. Among the troops that remained there was little discipline. The best among the officers had resigned their commissions in consequence of their sympathies with the cause of William. The commissariat was disorganized, the fortifications were in decay, and the country was almost denuded of military stores. When war was declared, there were, in spite of De Witt's utmost efforts, but 52,000 men with the standards. These were placed under William as captain general, with Frederick of Nassau, his natural uncle, and John Maurice, the Rhinegrave, then a man of 65 years of age, in charge of infantry and cavalry respectively. With these miserable forces the Republic prepared to confront as best it could an army of 176,000 men, led by Conde, Turenne, Luxembourg, and the great engineer Vauban, and admirably equipped in every arm. This was the escort which, as Louis said, permitted him to travel safely in the United Provinces. To face Ruyter's fleet of 135 ships he trusted chiefly to England, but he had himself collected 120 vessels mounted with 5,000 guns. As a retort to the medal which so aroused his anger, he caused another to be struck, in which the sun was portrayed dispersing the frogs from a marsh, and bearing as its motto, in allusion to the fact that it was through French assistance that the Republic had been created, the words "Evexi sed discutiam," I raised them up, and I will disperse them. End of section 23. Section 24 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmund Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 19. Invasion of the United Provinces, Part 1. 1. French occupation. Louis had spoken of travelling safely in the United Provinces, but none really regarded the enterprise as a light one. Conde, who was not wont to count danger highly, confessed the anxiety he felt. He even prophesied disaster. Temple compared Louis to a strong swimmer who plunges full of confidence in the water, but a strong current, the wasting of his strength, or an accident will surely sweep him away. Every provision was made for a difficult and dangerous expedition. The magnificent force collected at Charleroi was complete throughout its equipment. Vast stores were laid up at Neuss, a little below Cologne, and the labour of transport thus saved over half the route. Had De Witt been seconded with ability, this advantage would have been wanting to Louis. He had sent a detachment of cavalry to surprise Neuss, but the lack of discipline among the men, who betrayed their approach by a continuous fusillade upon the fowls and geese along the route, frustrated the design. His project for anticipating the declaration of war by entering Brest, Rochelle, and other open French ports and destroying the ships which were being fitted out there was rendered futile by the want of a strong central authority. The jealousy of Zealand caused the failure of a still bolder design. This was no less than to repeat the Chatham exploit, to sail up the Thames before the English fleet could issue out, and there in the heart of his kingdom challenge the power of Charles. Before the Zealand squadron had joined the fleet, the bulk of the English vessels were out of the river, and though Van Ghent, with a number of light ships, reached Sheerness, he could not force a further passage. Two routes were before Louis, by the Meuse or by the Rhine. Blocking the former stood Maastricht, a strong fortress garrisoned by Dutch troops. Supposing this obstacle overcome, and the line of the Meuse followed, the army would be confronted before it entered Dutch territory by the Waal, a deep and wide river defended at the crossing point by Nimwegen. If the Rhine route were chosen, it would be necessary to capture 4 fortresses: Orsoy, Rheinberg, Wesel, and Bürich, then in Dutch hands. Following the right bank, the army would finally have to cross the Isel, which leaves the Rhine just above Arnheim. It was determined to adopt the latter of these two plans. On May 5th, Louis joined the army at Charleroi. Marching swiftly along the Sambre, he led his forces near Liège on the Meuse. On the 15th, Maassek, a little north, and Tongeren, a little south of Maastricht, was taken and garrisoned, that place being thus completely masked. Passing the Meuse at Visé, Louis reached his magazines at Neuss on the 31st. Here the army was divided, Conde crossing the Rhine at Kaiserwerth. On June 2nd the fortresses were simultaneously attacked. By the 6th, Turenne had taken Orsoy, Bürich, and Rheinberg on the left bank, while Wesel on the right surrendered to Conde. Crossing at Wesel, Turenne rejoined Conde, and on the 11th the whole force was before the Isel, faced by William with all the troops he could muster. Conde now offered to wager that he would force a passage with a loss of less than 400 men. A plan even less dangerous was adopted. By crossing at Tolhuis, between the outflows of the Waal and the Isel, the whole army might easily be placed in the region between the Waal and the Rhine, known as the Betuwe. Robbed of the volume of the Waal, the river is here easily fordable by cavalry. William had moreover neglected to defend it in force. The celebrated passage of the Rhine, therefore, which, graced by the young monarch's presence, aroused such enthusiasm in France, has been described by Napoleon as an operation of the fourth order. It was made with only one serious mishap. Conde, as he led the dash into the river, was wounded in the wrist, and could take no further part in the advance. The next day a bridge was thrown over, and the whole army crossed into the Betuwe. The line of the IJssel being thus turned, William fell back towards Amsterdam with the regiments of Holland, Guelders, and Utrecht, numbering some 12,000 men. The rest refused to take part in the defence of any province but their own, and were left uselessly cooped up in Arnheim, Nijmegen, and the IJssel fortresses. Had Louis followed Conde's advice and sent his cavalry straight upon Amsterdam, the campaign would probably have ended at a blow. Yielding, however, to the presumption of Louvois, he ordered Turenne to complete the conquest of the Betuwe, while himself, after investing Nijmegen, crossed the Rhine once more below Arnheim, took that town, and proceeded leisurely to reduce the IJssel forts. The mistake was well nigh redeemed by the enterprise of the Count of Rochefort, who with 1,800 men made a dash for Molden, within sight of Amsterdam, in order to secure the sluices, passing William and capturing, as he sped on, Reuss, Amersfoort, and Naarden. A few of his men reached Molden, only to find that at the critical moment John Maurice had thrown in a garrison. Returning on his track, Rochefort on June 23rd entered Utrecht, which William had abandoned when the inhabitants refused to sacrifice their gardens and villas for its defence. Louis, however, in spite of the check at Molden, felt sure of his prey. Advancing from the IJssel, he took up his quarters at Utrecht, published a proclamation calling upon the towns which still held out to surrender, under the severest penalties of war, and waited for the submission of Amsterdam. But that submission never came. As early as April, the supreme necessity had been foreseen by De Witt. All had been in readiness to open the sluices and cut the dykes. On June 15th, the memorable resolution was come to. By the 18th, the sacrifice was consummated. The sea poured in, placing a waste of water between Louis and Amsterdam, and the province of Holland, at least, was saved. The citizens worked with the intensest energy to provide for their defence. The archives and state treasures were transferred thither from The Hague, and the States General held their sittings there. The mills were set to grind powder instead of corn. The regiments which had followed William were taken into the pay of Holland. Every fourth man among the peasantry was enlisted. Marines and gunners were drawn from the fleet. A strong force was sent to guard the shores of the Zelde Zee, while a swarm of light vessels rendered any attempt of the French ships to make use of the inundation hopeless. The resolution of the men of Holland rose day by day, now that they were fighting for their own province. The Republic had been well nigh lost through the want of imperial spirit. It was now saved by the vigour of local patriotism. A gleam of light came from Zeeland. Louis had left behind him a strong force near Ath to watch the Spanish Low Countries. Their commander, hearing that Aardenburg, which guarded the entry into Zeeland, was weakly garrisoned, marched through Spanish territory with 5,000 men and suddenly appeared before the town. Attacking with his advanced guard, he was driven back with loss. A second assault with his whole force was even more disastrous, while to complete his discomfiture, the captain of a Zeeland vessel landed his crew of 200 men, and by a vigorous flank attack so well seconded a sortie of the garrison that the French were compelled to retreat with great loss in killed and prisoners. By this spirited feat of arms, Zeeland was placed in safety, and French troops were shown to be not invincible. Thus saved on land by a desperate appeal to nature, the Republic had been saved at sea by the valour of her sailors. On June 7th, Ruyter encountered the united fleets of France and England in Southwold Bay. At 7 a.m. they joined battle. Ruyter, with whom was Cornelius de Witt, held the centre. He ordered the pilot to lay his vessel, the Seven Provinces, alongside James's flagship, the Prince, while Bankers and Van Ghent attacked the French squadron under Estrée and the English left wing under the Earl of Sandwich, respectively. Within 2 hours the Prince was so shattered that James, among whose faults a lack of personal bravery can never be numbered, was compelled to row off under the fire of the enemy, and hoist his flag upon the St. Michael. Before the day ended, the St. Michael too sank under him, and he barely escaped to the London. On the English right, Estrees fell back, pursued by Bonkers, while on the left a terrible fight raged throughout the long summer's day. Van Ghent was killed early in the action. Sandwich, after a desperate resistance to overwhelming attacks, perished with his son by the sinking of the boat in which they were rowing to another ship. Ruyter, who had been seriously endangered by the absence of Bonkers, recovered ascendancy late in the evening, and when night fell, the English were falling back with a loss of 5 ships of the line, 2,500 men, and no fewer than 18 captains. A dense fog prevented Ruyter from pushing his victory next day, but he had done his work. He had, at the critical moment, preserved the coasts of the Republic from attack, and was able to give his attention to secure the safe harbouring of the East India fleet. 2. The Orange Reaction. Murder of the De Witts. The prospect of final rescue was, however, so dim that the States General determined to negotiate with Louis. When their deputation reached his camp at Doesburg on the Yssel, they were told by Louvois that satisfaction for the allies of France and the payment of the entire expenses of the war were necessary preliminaries to a treaty. The States General were disposed to yield, but the deputies of Amsterdam and the Provincial Estates of Holland stood firm. Come what might, they declared that they would have no part in such a submission. In the vehement discussions which had arisen, De Witt had had no share. Each day of misfortune had led more definitely to his fall. A unity of command grew indispensable. The restoration of the Stadtholderate was demanded with increasing insistence, and to this restoration he was regarded as the main obstacle. The most atrocious calumnies, especially from the pulpits of the Calvinistic clergy who were vehemently in William's interests, were levelled against him. He was accused of being an accomplice of Louis, and of having sent to Venice a large sum of public money for his own use. On June 21st he was attacked in the streets and left for dead, and on the same day an attempt was made at Dordrecht upon the life of his brother Cornelius. One of the ruffians was captured and hung. The others, who were well known, found, to William's disgrace, a safe refuge in his camp. This deed only stimulated the reaction. One by one the towns of Zeeland and then of Holland proclaimed William the Stadtholder. He was summoned to Dordrecht, where he found the streets gay with orange and white flags, the white in punning reference to the Grand Pensionary's name below the orange. On July 1st the Provincial Estates of Holland and Zeeland sent to the towns, where it was received with enthusiasm, their vote for the abrogation of the Perpetual Edict, and on July 6th the prince was proclaimed Stadtholder by both provinces, with all the privileges of his ancestors, the election of the mayors of towns being alone reserved. In this vote Guelders, Utrecht and Overijssel were unable to concur, since they were in the hands of the French, while Friesland and Groningen retained as Stadtholder the son of their former governor, Henry Casimir of Nassau. At the same time the States General named the prince, henceforward William III, captain and admiral general of the Republic for life, saving the privileges of Henry Casimir. From this moment Louis had to reckon with the resistance not merely of a valiant and stubborn people driven to desperation, but of such a people swayed by a will as proud and as tenacious as his own. Of this reaction the national need had been the immediate cause. It represented also the triumph of the democratic spirit over the merchant aristocracy, which had so long kept the mass of people, as it had kept William, under its control. A terrible crime now signalized this triumph. The enmity against the De Witts had been disarmed neither by the murderous attack upon them, nor by the dignified address in which, after recounting the services of 19 years, John de Witt resigned to the Provincial Estates of Holland his charge as Grand Pensionary. The populace determined on a full accomplishment of their design. The blow fell first upon Cornelius, who, accused of plotting the murder of William, was enticed to the Hague, and there, by order of the Court of Holland, put to the torture and ordered to be banished from Holland and West Friesland. As he lay crippled from the rack, the mob surrounded the prison to prevent his departure. By a feigned message his brother was induced to visit him there. Means were found to remove the guards who protected the prison from attack. Then, bursting open the gates, the crowd rushed to the room where the brothers were expecting their fate. They found Cornelius stretched on the bed, while John de Witt read aloud from the Bible. A blow struck the reader on the face and covered him with blood. Then Cornelius was dragged to his feet. Almost before the brothers had exchanged a last kiss, he was hurled to the bottom of the stairs. Pushing their victims before them, the mob rushed into the street, and there the butchery was completed. As John de Witt, struck to the earth, raised himself on his knees, and holding his clasped hands to heaven, opened his lips to utter a last prayer, he was dashed backwards, a man placed his foot upon his throat, and crying aloud, "At last the perpetual edict is repealed," blew out his brains with a pistol. The bodies were stripped and horribly outraged, and then in the presence of a Calvinistic clergyman were dragged through the streets to the scaffold and hung by the feet amid the jeers of the people. Upon no one did this foul deed throw more disgrace than upon William. By his ungenerous coldness after the first attack, and by his protection of the assailants, he had made it evident that he was not likely to hinder the bloody work in hand. Not a word escaped him to control the popular passion. When appealed to for troops to quell the riot, he had turned a deaf ear, and when the murder was completed, he not only protected the ringleaders, but actually conferred upon them public preferment. The poor excuse that can be made for him is that by active steps to prevent this blind desire for vengeance, he might have imperilled his newly acquired position. End of section 24. Section 25 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmund Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 19. Invasion of the United Provinces, Part 2. 3. Negotiations with Louis. Close of the French attack. The States General had meanwhile, on June 29th, submitted their fresh proposals to Louis. They offered him Maastricht and its dependencies, a portion of the Generality, and 6 millions of livres. They demanded in return that their political and religious independence should remain intact. Louis has himself recorded his regret that, acting under the advice of Louvois, he refused this magnificent conclusion to the war, which, by placing in his hands a belt of fortresses from the Meuse to the mouth of the Scheldt, would have nullified the power of the Republic to oppose him whenever he should determine to incorporate the Spanish Low Countries with France. Louvois persuaded him to require, in addition, satisfaction to his allies, the immunity of all French subjects in the United Provinces from the ordinary dues and customs, the suppression of every commercial edict to the disadvantage of France issued since 1662, the establishment and support of Catholic churches with a payment of 24 millions of livres. And he insisted that every year a deputation should approach him at Paris to present him with a gold medal, in token that they held their liberty at his grace. The reply of the States General was that to accede to such demands would be to accede to dismemberment and the reversal of their constitution, the ruin of their trade and national dishonour. Charles II had meanwhile rejected the solicitations of the embassy which had been sent to him also, and had commissioned Buckingham, Arlington, and the Earl of Halifax to the French camp, with power to act in concord with Louis. On their way they visited William at Bodegraven and urged him to accept the offered terms. He told them that France might have Maastricht and the Rhine towns, but nothing more. "Do you not see," said Buckingham, "that the Republic is lost?" The answer illustrated the new spirit which prevailed. "I know one sure means of never seeing it, to die on the last dyke." From William the commissioners went to Louis. They found him willing to add on behalf of England demands for an unconditional surrender on the vexed question of the flag, free fishing in Dutch waters, the command of the shores of Zeeland, and the absolute sovereignty of the rest of the United Provinces for William. The joint demands were sent to the prince and laid by him before the States General, who returned an unequivocal rejection. William would not even answer the dispatch of Louis directly. He contented himself with forwarding him the copy of an extract from the formal resolution of the Assembly. To stimulate further the national spirit, he caused the dishonourable conditions to be posted on the public places of every town. This uncompromising tone had been strengthened by a fresh piece of good fortune. On July 14th, an Anglo-French fleet of 160 vessels was outside the Texel. Ruyter, with 50 partially equipped ships, could not have disputed their entrance. But a curious conjunction of wind and tide, long afterwards regarded as the visible interposition of Providence, came to the aid of the Republic, and before it was over, there gathered so fierce a 3 days' tempest that the shattered armament was compelled to return discomfited to the shores of England without disembarking a single man. All active military operations against Holland were now necessarily at an end. There was not a Dutch town south of the inundation which was not in the hands of the French, and nothing remained for the latter but to lie idle until the ice of winter should enable them to cross the floods which cut them off from Amsterdam. Leaving Turenne in command, Louis therefore returned to Saint-Germain on August 1st. A medal, still harping on his favourite image, was struck in his glory, in which the sun was represented passing through his 12 dwellings, pictured by the 12 principal conquered towns. Elsewhere the invasion had been foiled. The Duke of Luxembourg, aided by the forces of Cologne and Munster, had made himself master of Overijssel. He next fell upon Groningen. On June 30th he took Coevorden, and then attacked the town of Groningen itself with 22,000 men. Its fall would have led to the fall of Delfzijl, and the mouth of the Ems would have been open to the English fleet. The small garrison, however, of 4,400 men, defended themselves against an incessant bombardment and frequent assaults with so much vigour that at the end of 6 weeks the besiegers retired with heavy loss. They were now recalled from Overijssel by new events. 4. Failure of first coalition against Louis. The alarm with which Europe had been watching the progress of Louis began to find expression. Switzerland, even in her Catholic cantons, was so warm in behalf of the Republic that it was only by force that her regiments in the service of Louis were kept to their duty. Spain was doing her best to help the Dutch defend themselves, though unable yet to take the offensive, while Leopold, though for a long time held back by the Partition Treaty, was so alarmed by the dangers to the peace of the Empire from the extension of the French power to the Rhine that he formed on June 23rd an alliance with Frederick William, the Grand Elector of Brandenburg, by which each engaged to raise 12,000 men at once, ostensibly to preserve the Peace of Westphalia and the internal peace of the Empire, and another with the States General on October 27th, by which he was to receive a subsidy on joining the Grand Elector in the field. No peace was to be made with Louis without the consent of himself and the General Elector until the war finally closed. Louis had acted with his usual promptitude. He withdrew Turenne with 16,000 men to Westphalia, and placed Condé with 17,000 to guard Alsace. Duras was stationed on the Meuse. Luxembourg remained with a small force at Utrecht. On September 12th the Austrian general Montecuccoli, the Duke of Lorraine, and the Grand Elector effected their junction, intending to cross the Rhine and join William. Reinforced by the troops of Münster and Cologne from Overijssel, Turenne drove them back to Friedberg. At the end of November, however, they succeeded at crossing at Weissenau, only to find that Turenne had, by forced marches, placed himself in their path. Completely outgeneraled, they were compelled in December to recross the river and, closely pressed, to retreat to Darmstadt. All through the winter Turenne pushed them home, while Louvois, jealous of the great captain's fame, was sending him reiterated orders to go into winter quarters. He gave the allies not a moment's repose, and by the beginning of March had driven them across the Weser. Nor did he leave them until, utterly baffled, the Austrians had retired into Franconia, the Brandenburg contingent to Halberstadt. He again established his wearied troops in Westphalia. William had been meanwhile endeavouring to take advantage of this diversion. His first attempts on Naarden and Woerden had been foiled by Luxemburg. Undiscouraged, he suddenly threw himself with 35,000 men upon Duras, drove him across the Meuse, and on December 15th invested Charleroi. But before Conde could hasten from Alsace to the rescue, the Count of Montal had succeeded by a desperate attack in forcing William's lines and relieving the place. The prince had no course left but to retreat in haste to Amsterdam. The victories of Turenne now deprived the Dutch of the ally in whom they most trusted. Frederick William, utterly disheartened and tempted by liberal offers from Louis, agreed on June 6, 1673, to remain strictly neutral, to withdraw his garrisons from all Dutch towns, to stay beyond the Weser, and to allow French troops to pass into Germany to punish any infraction of the Treaty of Münster. By fresh arrangements with the Archbishop of Cologne and the Elector of Hanover, Louis also secured the continued occupation of Overijssel, and so deprived the Dutch of all hope of future aid from the side of Westphalia. Sweden now intervened. Fettered by fear of Denmark from taking an active part in the conflict, and unwilling to see England without a rival at sea, she thought her engagements with Louis sufficiently satisfied for the moment by sending, in September 1672, both to Louis and Charles to offer her mediation. And in June 1673 a conference was opened at Cologne. Before the absolute refusal of the Dutch, who, as Charles complained to his Parliament, treated his ambassadors with the contempt of conquerors, and not, as might have been expected from men in their condition, to listen to the extravagant demands of the two kings, nothing could be done. In July, Sweden endeavoured to secure some relaxation of these demands, but the moment was unfortunate, for Louis was in the flush of a new success. Maastricht, after a 4-week siege, had fallen before the genius of Vauban. The end of August found the Dutch as uncompromising as Louis, for they had just fought and won a desperate campaign upon their own element. Charles had in the spring made all ready for another descent upon their coasts, for he saw in a striking victory over the Republic the sole chance of extricating himself from the increasing difficulties of his position at home. He had collected 8,000 men at Yarmouth under the French general Schomberg, to be transported to Zeeland, when the way should have been cleared by a defeat of the Dutch fleet. On June 7th, Rupert and Estrees met Ruyter and Tromp with almost equal force. The day was bloody but indecisive. The conflict was renewed on the 14th, when the Dutch fought with such fury that the English were driven back to the Thames. In the middle of August they set out again, this time with Schomberg's men on board. On the 21st took place, close to the Zeeland coast, the battle upon which hung the fate of the Republic. From daylight till dark the terrible duel lasted. The church towers and housetops along the shore were crowded with anxious spectators. Not until 7 in the evening did Rupert lose hope of victory. Then, as Ruyter prepared for a last desperate onset, he gave the signal for retreat, and the allied fleets sailed sullenly back to Yarmouth. William now replied once more to Louis and Charles. The French might have Maastricht, Zutphen, and Hilst. To England he would grant the salute, and nothing more. Cologne might retain Rheinberg, but Munster should have not an acre of land. The States General further declared that after September 15th they would only make peace in concert with the Emperor and Spain. 5. Second coalition against Louis. Peace between England and the Republic. Evacuation of the United Provinces by the French. William's tone was determined too by the fact that a coalition against Louis more powerful than the last had now been formed. Spain, profoundly moved by the capture of Maastricht, had managed to raise money to supply her army and even to subsidize Leopold. On August 15th, the latter issued a manifesto to the Diet explaining that he went to war to defend the Empire, and on the 30th 3 separate treaties were signed by the parties to the new alliance. By the first, Leopold agreed to march 30,000 men to the Rhine, where the Dutch would meet them with 20,000. By the second, Spain promised the Dutch to join her forces to those of the Empire, and for a fresh guarantee of the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle, to insist upon France restoring to the Republic all her conquests, while she herself was to regain the limits of the Peace of the Pyrenees, and to retain Maastricht and Vrohoven. By the third, the errant Duke of Lorraine, who furnished 18,000 men to the coalition, was to be restored to his estates at the end of the war. Peace was to be made only by the mutual consent of all the contracting parties. Active operations began at once. William, outmanoeuvring Conde, now in command of the United Provinces, captured Naarden, August 28th, and marching right forward to the Rhine joined Montecuccoli, who had slipped by Turenne, a little below Bonn, which fell before their united efforts on November 12th. The effect was immediate. Cologne and Munster made peace, the electors of Trèves and Mayence joined the coalition. But far more important was it that, driven by the need of money, which Louis could only partially satisfy, and heartily tired of a war in which he had experienced little but defeat, Charles, after a conflict of several months, yielded to the conditions imposed upon him by Parliament, to whom this cabal war, unlike the former, had from the first been distasteful, and in the teeth of his engagements with Louis, made peace with the Dutch. By the Treaty of London, February 19th, 1674, the Republic yielded the honour of the flag from Cape Finisterre northwards, agreed to pay 800,000 crowns, and granted to England the retention of all her conquests outside Europe. All future disputes between the rival East India Companies were to be submitted to arbitration. Charles promised that he would give no help to the enemies of the Republic. He managed, however, to evade the recall of the English regiments in the French service, and his ambassadors at Cologne, where the conference lingered on until the end of March, remained to act in the French interest. But even these defections did not fully represent the weakening of Louis's cause. In January 1674, the coalition was joined by Denmark, and in March by the Electors Palatine. In April, Leopold had gained the Dukes of Brunswick and Lüneburg. In May, he induced the Diet to declare war in the name of the Empire, and on July 1st, the Grand Elector once more threw in his lot with the enemies of France. Louis at once determined to concentrate all his strength. Bitterly repenting his refusal, 18 months earlier, of a splendid termination of his enterprise against the Republic, he saw himself forced to relinquish it without having wrung from her a single concession, and with Maastricht and Grave alone out of 40 large towns to represent his conquests. End of section 25. Section 26 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmund Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 20. The Parliamentary Conflict in England. 1. The Test Act, February 4th through March 29th, 1673. It is necessary now to recur to the progress of the Parliamentary conflict in England. The subsidies of Louis, the supplies previously voted, and the spoil of the stop of the Exchequer had enabled Charles to dispense with an appeal to Parliament for nearly 2 years. These funds being exhausted, and Louis not being prepared to satisfy his needs, he met the Houses on February 4th, 1673. Assuming a tone of confidence, he put lightly aside the question of the standing army, whose dark hovering on Blackheath was exciting much suspicion, stating indeed that several more regiments would be necessary in the spring, and he gave the usual assurances to the Church. Then, trusting to waive all attack upon the Declaration of Indulgence by a strong expression of his personal will, he ended his reference to it by the words, "And I will deal plainly with you. I am resolved to stick to my declaration." Shaftesbury followed with the famous Delenda est Carthago speech, in which he expressed the necessity of beating the Republic as being England's eternal enemy, both by interest and inclination, to the ground. On many questions the Commons were unexpectedly compliant. They introduced a bill for the monthly supply of £70,000 for 18 months, for the King's extraordinary occasions, thus avoiding direct reference to the war, of which the country was now weary, but were careful to proceed no further with it for the moment. They refrained from attacking the stop of the Exchequer, the war, or the Cabal. This was because they had chosen to challenge the King on one matter alone. On February 8th took place the first debate on the Declaration. In its support the old arguments were used: the advantage of trade, the increase of population which toleration always promoted, the folly of causing discontent at home while a war demanding all the nation's energies was at hand, the distinction between the prerogative in temporal and spiritual matters was dwelt upon. As the master of a ship may throw over cargo in a storm, or one may walk over another man's grounds in an emergency, so when there is sufficient occasion the King may dispense with the law. Can government, it was boldly asked, be without arbitrary government? On the other side the distinction advanced was utterly repudiated. Granting that the King had power to pardon crime in individual cases, he had none to license crime by dispensing with law. The Declaration broke through no fewer than 40 Acts of Parliament, repealable by Parliament alone. The debate closed with a vote, carried by 168 to 116, that penal statutes in matters ecclesiastical cannot be suspended but by Act of Parliament. Beyond the challenge thus thrown down to the King, the debate was important as showing the distance travelled by public opinion since the passing of the Second Conventicle Act. A suggestion that the House itself should prepare a bill for the ease of His Majesty's Protestant subjects that are dissenters was unanimously adopted. The Anglican furor had evidently to a great extent passed away. The Commons was no longer on their defence against Protestant dissent, but was engaged in providing that the Church of England should not be devoured by Papists. The vote of February 8th had been followed by an address to the King. Obtaining from him only an evasive request that the Commons would themselves prepare a bill in the same sense as the Declaration, they pressed for a full and satisfactory answer, and enforced their demand by a vote, February 28th, that no one refusing the oaths or the sacrament, according to the Anglican rites, should be capable of holding any office under the Crown. Charles hereupon appealed to the Lords for their advice. They coldly replied that his previous answer, referring the question to the Commons in a parliamentary way, was good and gracious. On March 7th they joined the Lower House in desiring the King at once to order all Jesuits and Catholic priests, except those in attendance on the Queen and the foreign ambassadors, to leave the kingdom within 30 days, to instruct the justices to execute the penal laws against them with all rigour, and to call upon all officers and soldiers at once to take the oaths and receive the sacrament. Pressed to yield by his ministers, who were becoming alarmed for their own safety, by Louis, who saw that unless supplies were granted his ally must necessarily make peace, and by the female favourites, whose sources of wealth were endangered, Charles on March 8th cancelled the declaration to which only a month before he had declared his fixed resolve to adhere. The concession was too tardy. The Commons were anxious to put an end to the Catholic question. A bill for a Test Act, suggested by Arlington to destroy Clifford, had already been before them. On March 12th it was read a third time. In the interval, it had been pointed out that if passed in the terms of the vote of February 28th, it might be inoperative for its purpose, since the Pope could grant a dispensation to take the oaths and even to receive the Anglican sacrament. He was, however, precluded from any such step regarding cardinal matters of faith. The Act, therefore, was framed to include an explicit denial of the doctrine of transubstantiation. In the Lords, in spite of the passionate resistance of the greater part of the Catholic peers under the leadership of Clifford, who broke out upon it as monstrum horrendum ingens, it passed by a large majority. On March 29th it received the royal assent. Only then did the Commons pass the Subsidy Bill. Parliament had at last won the victory for which it had been striving since the Restoration. James, to the great loss of the nation, resigned his post of Lord High Admiral. The second part of Clifford's horoscope was now fulfilled. He laid down the treasurer's staff, went into strict retirement, and shortly died, it was reported by his own hand, of the disappointment of his hopes. The cabal was shattered, and from this moment Charles abandoned all attempt to secure favour for the proscribed creed. The influence of James, however, was sufficient to secure the nomination of Sir Thomas Osborne, soon created Earl of Danby, to succeed Clifford as Lord Treasurer, an appointment which turned Arlington, who thus suffered a second rebuff, into a keen though concealed opponent of the government. Meanwhile, the bill for the ease of Protestant dissenters had been read a third time in the Commons. Difficulties arose only at the last moment. In the Lords, the bishops opposed it with vehemence, and secured its return to the Commons clogged with unacceptable amendments. By passing the Bill of Supply, the Commons had lost their hold on events. Charles, though honestly anxious to see the measure become law, adjourned the Parliament, and the bill was for the time lost. 2. Refusal of supplies, Shaftesbury in opposition, peace with the Dutch, October 20th, 1673, through February 24th, 1674. The very fact that precautions had been taken against the Catholics appeared to increase the general alarm. Much had indeed taken place during the recess to justify this feeling. The Test Act had been largely evaded, and the flaunting of Papists in Whitehall was evident to all. Louis's demand for the establishment of Catholic churches in the conquered Dutch towns had roused the Protestant feeling of Englishmen to the utmost, while the national jealousy of France had been excited to a fever pitch by the belief that the conduct of Estrees, who both in the last battle and in that of Solebay had avoided giving any effective assistance, had been prompted by the desire of Louis to see the two great naval powers destroy each other's strength. Rupert, in his conviction that this was the case, had become the leader of a vehement anti-French party. Then there was the standing army, under the command of Schomberg, a Frenchman, though a Protestant, with a declared Catholic second in command. And lastly, the marriage of James to the Princess of Modena, a marriage known to have been arranged in deference to the personal wishes of Louis, not only opened up the prospect of a long Catholic succession, but expressed in a definite form the alliance of the court with the French and Catholic cause. When, therefore, Parliament met in October 1673, it was in a fighting mood. The silencing of some leading members of the old opposition by the personal influence of the king could avail but little against the rising tide of passion. The most influential members of the country party rose one after another to urge the House to refuse a supply until their grievances had been redressed. "Here is money asked of us," said Lord Cavendish, "to carry on a war we were never advised about, and what we have given is turned to raising of families and not paying the king's debts." Lord Cornbury, Clarendon's eldest son, had begged for the king and wanted for him, and would willingly do it again, but he too was for refusing supply. "Do this," said another, "and we may deliver ourselves both from France and Rome." A vote was accordingly carried to refuse any supply before the end of the 18 months' assessment, unless the obstinacy of the Dutch should render it necessary, and before the dangers from Popish councils and other grievances had been removed. Of these grievances the standing army was first named. The member who declared that these forces had not been raised for the war, but the war made for raising the forces, expressed the general belief. Passing then to evil counsellors, they had just uttered Lauderdale's name when they were prorogued until January 7th. When the king again faced Parliament, he no longer asked for money to continue the war, but to secure peace, and this time he did not hesitate, at the instance of Louis, to meet the great council of the nation with a gross and deliberate lie. To remove their suspicions, he would lay his treaties with France and all the articles of them, without the least reserve, before a small committee of both houses, and he added, "I assure you there is no other treaty with France, either before or since, which shall not be made known." The treaty which was shown was, however, the second Treaty of Dover of December 1670, which, in order the better to deceive Parliament, had been executed afresh as late as February 1672. The original treaty of June 1st, 1670, with the article providing for the announcement of the king's conversion and the subsidy from Louis for that purpose, was carefully concealed. The speech, we learn from Lord Conway, who was behind the scenes, was produced by the consultations of many days and nights, and we are told that the king fumbled in delivering it and made it worse than in the print. The fraud availed little. The houses went steadily on with the work which had been interrupted. They were now under guidance which rendered them doubly formidable. Shaftesbury had during the recess been dismissed. Since the cancelling of the Declaration, his sympathies had never been with the court. Probably he had been told by the disappointed Arlington the true story of the Dover Treaty, and the vexation of one who thought himself a master of intrigue at having so long been a dupe would of itself be enough to account for the immediate change in his attitude after the prorogation. In the Lords he organized a regular opposition, the members of which met frequently to arrange the plan of attack. On the day after the king's speech he carried an address for the banishment from London of all papists or reputed papists, not householders or in attendance on peers. The dread of a Catholic succession, henceforward his watchword, was expressed in a vote to prepare a bill for the education of the royal children as Protestants, and for securing all future marriages in the royal line with Protestants under the penalty of exclusion. Provisions equally drastic were inserted in the proposed bill for the education of the children of Catholic peers. The practice of sending them to Catholic schools on the Continent was especially to be prohibited. In the Commons there arose a renewed outcry against evil counsellors, which on January 13th, 1674, took a definite shape in an address to the king to remove Lauderdale and Buckingham from all their employments and from his presence and councils for ever. Articles of impeachment were then proposed against Arlington, the great conduit pipe of all the previous actions of the government. His defence, however, was so able and his friends so numerous and earnest, since it was understood that he was now out of favour, that he secured a majority of 166 to 127. It was at this point that Charles announced that terms of peace had been made to him by the Dutch which he could accept. Parliament eagerly welcomed the close of the ill-starred war, and the Treaty of London was signed on February 19th. The king, now unable to extract a farthing from the Commons, put an end to the session, and so to all progress with the attacks from both Lords and Commons. The House, however, did not separate February 24th until the Habeas Corpus Bill, with its extended provisions against arbitrary rule, though it did not pass the Lords, had secured a permanent place in men's minds by passing all its stages in the Commons, and until an address had been sent up praying for the disbanding of all troops raised since January 1st, 1663. The course of affairs in the recess was to be determined by events on the Continent. End of section 26. Section 27 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmund Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 21. Louis, William, Charles, Parliament, 1674 to 1677. Part 1. 1. Campaign of 1674. The campaign of 1674 displayed the advantages possessed by a single power ably led against a coalition, however extensive. Louis, as usual, was beforehand with his foes. While Turenne and Conde held the Upper Rhine and the Spanish Low Countries, and Schomberg faced the Spaniards in Roussillon, Louis himself invaded Franche-Comté, and in less than 2 months once more carried the French frontier on the east to its natural barrier, the Jura Mountains. Conde, meanwhile, confronted the superior forces of William on the Meuse and the Sambre. He cautiously bided his time until the prince, unable to induce him to give battle, began to withdraw his troops. Then he dashed at the rear guard, routed it at Senef, and captured the whole baggage train. A second and third attack failed to dislodge William's main body from the strong position which he held, and 3 days of terrible carnage, no fewer than 25,000 men were left dead or dying on the field, ended with no decisive advantage. The campaign in the Low Countries closed with the loss to France of only Denon and Huy on the Meuse and Grave. The fighting on the Rhine displayed more than ever the superiority of Turenne's generalship. With greatly inferior forces, he met the Imperialists at Sinsheim, June 16th, between the Rhine and the Neckar, and drove them back across the latter river. Then followed, during July and August, the first of the terrible wastings of the Palatinate on both sides of the Rhine. Turenne was determined that the enemy should find no subsistence there, and he made the whole land a desert. Strongly reinforced, the Imperialists again crossed at Mayence and marched up the left bank to Spire, there finding Turenne prepared to defend Lower Alsace. They recrossed and reached Strasbourg just in time to anticipate him, as he came with all haste by the other bank. Having effected a junction with a fresh army brought up by the Grand Elector, they prepared to chase him out of Alsace. The emergency called out all Turenne's powers. With splendid confidence he promised Louis that if fully supported, he would by the end of the year drive the enemy beyond the Rhine. The redemption of his pledge forms one of the most memorable feats of modern warfare. For a month, by a masterly use of his small force, he kept the enemy from penetrating the rough country which he held. On November 29th, he suddenly carried his whole army across the Vosges to Lixheim, near Sarrebourg, on the western side of the chain. He then, with the mountains as a screen between him and the enemy, rapidly traversed the whole line of the Vosges from north to south, picking up reinforcements on the way. At the southern end, where the chain bends sharply to the west, he divided his army into 4 bodies, and keeping his ultimate plan profoundly secret, sent them each by a separate route back over the angle thus formed, with orders to rendezvous at Belfort on the eastern side of the famous bulwark of France, which guards the gap between the Vosges and the Jura. So well was he obeyed that after 3 weeks' wrestling with all the difficulties of snow-covered and almost trackless mountains, he found himself at Belfort on December 27th with a wearied but eager army of 40,000 men. Without a day's delay he swept northward upon the unsuspecting foe, who, as he anticipated, had scattered themselves throughout Alsace when they learned his retreat, routed them at Mulhausen, drove a large body across the Swiss frontier, and on January 5th utterly defeated the Grand Elector at Colmar. Then, pushing on, chased the enemy before him in confusion to Strasbourg. Panic-stricken and quarrelling among themselves, they hurried across the river, and within a week from the Battle of Colmar, Turenne had fulfilled his promise. Not a German soldier remained on the French side of the Rhine. None the less, Louis was daily becoming more anxious to separate his enemies. With the Dutch he had good hopes, for they had now no direct interest in the war. Charles, on concluding his separate peace, had offered his mediation, and London again became the centre of diplomatic intrigue. 2. William of Orange, connection with England, his power in the United Provinces. William was at this time exercising much influence upon English politics. In confidential communication with the Shaftesbury cabal, he had through them practically driven Charles to make peace, and he was not without hope that he might even oblige him to join the coalition against France. Up to the Battle of Senef, therefore, he had declined the English mediation. That event, however, and the powerful movement which was arising at home for peace, changed his view. Conciliatory letters passed between the uncle and nephew, and William suggested that he should visit the king in London. But Charles, to gratify Louis, coldly declined the proffered visit. He went still further. Though fully aware of the exasperation caused by the last 3 prorogations, he determined on a 4th. He was resolved to be henceforth his own foreign minister. He had forced Arlington to sell his office of Secretary of State to Sir Joseph Williamson, who possessed no influence. Buckingham had been thrown over on the ground of the late vote of the Commons. Danby, by virtue of his usefulness in finding money and in manufacturing votes, had, under the protection of the Duchess of Portsmouth, the conduct of all home business, but of that alone. Concealing his intention even from him to the last moment, Charles announced to his silent and astonished council that Parliament would not meet for business until April 1675. The effect of this master stroke, as he deemed it, was immediate, but in a direction opposite to his hopes. William, in angry disappointment, at once gave up all thoughts of accommodation with France. He stayed all conciliatory action on the part of the States General, and induced them to refuse the proposed suspension of arms at sea, and to demand not only the abrogation of the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle, but even the enforcement of the conditions of that of the Pyrenees. This firmness and the knowledge of William's influence in England at once altered Charles's fickle resolutions. He made up his mind to bind the prince to the interests of the crown by a step which had long been discussed, a marriage with Mary, the eldest daughter of James. The first suggestion of this alliance had originally been but one of several expressions of the anxiety which arose from the childlessness of the Queen. The possibility of putting forward Monmouth, his favourite son, as heir had been mentioned, while as early as 1669 Buckingham had urged a Parliamentary divorce, and Shaftesbury, when in office, had supported the idea. Charles, however, to his credit, never seriously entertained a proposal so injurious to his wife, nor did he give the slightest countenance to the scheme concerning Monmouth. Then came the second marriage of James, with its prospects of a Catholic succession should a son be born. Nobody at present seriously proposed the exclusion of James, and the alliance of William and Mary offered itself as a means of reconciling the doctrine of hereditary right with the abhorrence of a Catholic king. Charles had hitherto, in deference to Louis and James, rejected the idea. Now, however, in spite of the remonstrances of the former, he dispatched Arlington and Lord Ossory in November to the Hague to secure, if possible, peace between France and the Dutch, and the betrothal of William to Mary. Peace, it was soon found, was impracticable on William's terms. As to the marriage, it was declined on 2 grounds. Another child was about to be born to James, and if this were a boy, the eventual advantage to William of such a marriage would be slight. His friends in England, too, pressed him to refuse to associate himself with James in a way which must weaken his influence with themselves. William had meanwhile been strengthening and extending his power at home. The election of his adherent, Fagel, to succeed De Witt, had in a great measure secured the control of the States General, while by obtaining the right of nominating the mayors of the towns, which had hitherto been expressly reserved to the towns themselves, he had largely annulled the Republican constitution. His offices of Stadtholder, Captain and Admiral General for Holland and Friesland had been made hereditary, while Hilders and Utrecht had, since the French conquest, been placed entirely under his control. Hilders, indeed, had offered him the sovereign name and power, and he was anxious to accept it. But, just as when war was at their gates, the people had demanded a strong executive, so when the danger was removed, the old jealousy of despotism reasserted itself, and William was obliged by general outcry to put aside the idea. In this state of affairs the approaching meeting of the English Parliament excited the attention of all Europe. For a while it was doubtful whether it would meet at all, since Louis had promised Charles another subsidy if he would dissolve or even prorogue it for a year, and he was warmly supported by James for his own reasons. But Danby offered the strongest opposition. That able minister, the forerunner of Harley in party management and of Walpole in parliamentary corruption, was sincerely opposed to the influence of France. He had shaped a bold policy of his own, which, if successful, would ruin the Shaftesbury cabal at a blow, a return, namely, to the policy of Clarendon, a cordial union between Royalism and Anglicanism, in opposition to all forms of nonconformity and limitation of the prerogative. He had induced the king to publish during the recess a fresh body of edicts, framed in conference with the bishops at Lambeth, enforcing the penal laws, especially against the Catholics, and he had spared no efforts to win over individual members of the Commons. The last prorogation had, in his opinion, been a dangerous measure. A dissolution would throw the whole power into the hands of Shaftesbury and his friends. The navy, meanwhile, was rotting away for want of money which a parliament alone could give. Charles accepted Danby's advice, the more readily as the development of English commerce had increased his annual revenue by £150,000. The only promise he would give Louis was to dissolve Parliament should they insist on fixed times of meeting, attack either James or his ministers, or meddle with alliances or terms of peace. Louis fell back upon bribery. It was now that Parliament began to earn with justice the name of the Pensionary Parliament. English, French, Spanish, and Dutch money jingled in the same pockets. Rouvigny had £10,000 for direct bribery of members, with a large sum to enable him to keep a lavish table. The Spanish ambassador came with full hands. Van Beuningen took a house in Westminster and exercised splendid hospitality. The Danish resident had a grant from the Republic for the same object. The Shaftesbury opposition were equally ready. Their leader, in a letter to Lord Carlisle, had sounded the note of attack. Danby was, if possible, to be overthrown, and a dissolution brought about. 3. Parliament, April to June 1675. The non-resisting test. It was then, with a frank return to the policy of Clarendon, that Charles and Danby met Parliament in April 1675, and the Lambeth edicts were quoted as an earnest of the intention to regard the Church in its double aspect, as a Protestant Church opposed to Popery, and an established Church opposed to dissent. Danby's wholesale corruption of the Commons had so far succeeded that he was enabled to defeat the vigorous attack which was at once made upon him on the ground of his arbitrary government of the exchequer and his lavish expenditure of public money for private and family ends. The court also scored a success in the rejection of a resolution incapacitating placemen from sitting in Parliament. So evenly, however, were the parties balanced, and so exasperated had feeling become, that it was only after a scene of unparalleled disorder, following an even division, when blows were exchanged, and but for the promptitude of the Speaker, blood would undoubtedly have been shed on the floor of the House, that a resolution for an address to the King to recall the English troops in the French service was defeated by a single vote. From this point the Commons again became impracticable. The rapid progress of Louis in the Spanish Low Countries, and still more the growth of the French navy, roused such jealousy in England and threw such strength into the hands of the opposition, that Louis instructed Ruvigny to offer a truce, should it become necessary to soothe this irritation. So pressed was Charles by his own people, by Spain, and by the Republic to take measures for the defence of the Spanish Low Countries and to compel Louis to make peace, that he declared to Ruvigny that he was like a besieged fortress. The Commons took up their old position of regarding themselves as on guard against popery in France, and they passed a resolution to consider no bills whatever except such as might come down from the Lords. Danby determined to make his great effort in the Upper House, where he was sure of a majority. The meaning of the conference at Lambeth was shown when he brought forward the famous non-resisting test. It was proposed that no one should hold office or sit in either house unless he had first taken the oath imposed on nonconformist ministers by the 5 Mile Act, to attempt no alteration in the government of church or state. The object was to drive Catholic peers from the Lords and Presbyterian members from the Commons. The Anglican clergy, the Parliament, and the executive would then form one dominant party, freed from all risks of opposition. It was understood that if the test were passed, the court would at once yield to the demands of Parliament as to foreign policy. Against every stage of this audacious measure the opposition lords, led with remarkable power by Shaftesbury, fought for 15 days with persistent courage. They pointed out that so far from the bill affording safeguards against popery, any papist might, as the oath was drawn, take it without hesitation, and they secured its amendment as follows: "I will not endeavour the alteration of the Protestant religion, now established in the Church of England, or of the government of Church and State." Whether the bill would have passed the Commons is doubtful, but parties were so equal in a matter in which neither France nor popery was directly concerned that it was possible. That stage, however, was never reached. A dispute suddenly sprang up between the two houses on the old question of the right of appeal to the Lords. That which had happened in 1668 happened again. Neither house would give way an inch. Shaftesbury exerted himself to the utmost to make reconciliation impossible. The dispute absorbed the whole attention of both houses, and there was no opportunity for introducing the bill in Commons. Danby was thus at the outset completely baffled, and Charles was compelled in June to prorogue the Parliament until October. When it again met, the situation was profoundly modified by events on the Continent, which more than ever made it necessary for Louis to secure the neutrality of England. 4. Reverses of Louis in 1675. Secret treaty with Charles II. In the spring and early summer of 1675, Louis, always beforehand, had captured Liège and Limbourg, and had recovered Dinant, Huy, and Givet. The line of the Meuse was thus secured from the French frontier to Maastricht, while that of the Moselle was blocked by the possession of Trèves. The junction of the Imperialists with the Spaniards was now, therefore, fully guarded against. Turenne faced Montecuccoli in Alsace. By compelling Strasbourg to keep its neutrality, and therefore to refuse the Imperialists a passage across the Rhine, he forced them to pass into Lower Alsace at Spire. He then threw a bridge over the river a little before Strasbourg, and marched along the right bank into the Palatinate, thus getting to Montecuccoli's rear. His antagonist at once recrossed to contest the country between the Rhine and the Neckar, where Turenne had won his former victory at Sinsheim. After 6 weeks' manoeuvring, Turenne took the offensive, intending to drive Montecuccoli behind the Black Forest. In July he succeeded in cutting his line, and thus obliged him to leave the valley of the Rhine and retreat to Sasbach, on the slopes of the Black Forest, to the east of Strasbourg. Here Turenne came up with him. As he was visiting his outposts before the attack, he was heard to utter one of his rare expressions of confidence. "I have them now," he exclaimed. "They shall not escape me again." Hardly were the words out of his lips when a chance shot struck him in the breast, and the great commander fell dead. End of section 27. Section 28 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmund Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 21. Louis, William, Charles, Parliament, 1674 to 1677, Part 2. The effect of this blow was for the moment disastrous to France. Montecuccoli at once took the offensive. The French retreated in disorder to the Rhine, but turned to bay at Altenheim, and fought so desperately that the Imperialists left 5,000 men dead on the field. They then crossed the river hurriedly at Schellstadt, while Montecuccoli passed at Strasbourg and laid siege to Haguenau and Saverne, the fall of which would have entailed that of Philipsburg. But Conde flew to the rescue, and these fortresses were preserved. So skilful were his operations that before the end of the year the Allies had abandoned Alsace and recrossed the Rhine. It was his last exploit. Weary of action, he retired at the end of the campaign to a country life in his own domains. Meanwhile, disaster had happened on the Moselle. Crequi had been utterly beaten before Trèves by the old Duke of Lorraine on September 3rd, and Trèves itself had been captured after a desperate defence. The Swedes, too, who had at length entered Brandenburg, had been thoroughly beaten, June 18th, by the Grand Elector, and forced to retreat to Mecklenburg. Their evil fortune had followed them at sea. The Dutch and Danish fleets had inflicted upon them a crushing defeat in the Baltic, which led to the loss of the possessions which they had acquired in North Germany by the Peace of Westphalia. It was now Louis whose thoughts were turned toward peace. The state of his kingdom impelled him in the same direction. The drain of war and diplomacy had exhausted the treasure which Colbert had collected, while general discontent was once more spreading among the overburdened peasantry. Armed revolt had even broken out in Brittany, and in Bordeaux, the old centre of turbulence. Ruvigny redoubled his efforts in England to secure a French party. But a French party as such he found it impossible to secure. On the contrary, it was clear that the next session would be of a vehemently anti-French character, especially as Danby himself had no love for France. It could be only by assisting one or the other side in the domestic struggle that Louis could hope to neutralize this spirit. He therefore applied to Shaftesbury and his friends. Their terms were simple. If Louis would help them to overthrow Danby and secure liberty of conscience for Protestants, they would withdraw their opposition to his schemes. This explains those closetings of Shaftesbury with James, which so puzzled people at the time, and which established against Danby a coalition of the Nonconformists, the Catholics, and Louis. James received £20,000 for distribution at the end of the session, on condition that the English troops were not recalled, nor any vote passed hostile to France. But Louis was bent on a still surer way of securing the inaction of England. More than ever he pressed upon Charles, through the potent influence of Louise de Keroualle, the necessity of being free of the control of Parliament. By August 19th he had drawn from him, by promise of £100,000 a year, an engagement to dissolve his Parliament if it were still violent against France, or refused to provide him with money. Thus on both sides he was safe. He soon had cause to congratulate himself on his precautions. When Parliament met, October 13th, 1675, the request for supplies to pay the debts of the Crown and to build ships was listened to with an ominous silence. The reply, when it came, was a bill to incapacitate anyone from sitting in either house without taking an oath against popery, and an absolute refusal to pay the debts. In view, indeed, of the growing strength of the French at sea, a large addition of ships was voted, but the intense distrust of the king was shown by the fact that, besides the usual appropriation clause being passed, a proposal to lodge the money, not as usual in the Exchequer, but in the hands of the Council of the City of London, was lost by only 7 votes. Meanwhile, the opposition under Shaftesbury's leadership, hopeless of overthrowing Danby so long as the present Parliament continued, consisting as it did largely of men dependent on his bounty, was pressing in both houses for the dissolution which Louis was urging directly on Charles. But the present members, especially those elected during the reaction at the beginning of the reign, had all to lose and nothing to gain by the proposal, and no division was taken. In the Lords, where James and the Catholic peers supported it, it was lost by 2 votes only. Foiled in this attempt, Shaftesbury determined to gain his ends by rendering business impossible. It was easy to do this by raising the former dispute on the subject of appeals to the Lords. It at once became manifest that nothing else would be looked at until the Lords yielded, and Shaftesbury took care that they should not yield. Charles was forced to close the session, but he bitterly disappointed Shaftesbury and his friends. The practical certainty that a new Parliament would consist of men still more vehemently opposed to the prerogative again won the day. Instead of dissolving, he prorogued Parliament for 15 months to February 1677. He then, with cool audacity, demanded his subsidy from Louis. This had been promised for a dissolution only, but to Louis, as has been seen, English neutrality was now more than ever essential. That neutrality was safe if he could keep Charles dependent on him for these 15 months. How accurately Danby had gauged the situation is shown by the fact that Rouvigny was informed that the money had been already entered in the English estimates for the coming year. Louis gave way without hesitation. He was rewarded when, in spite of all that Danby could do, Charles further consented to an agreement that neither monarch should listen to any proposition from abroad contrary to the other's welfare, or make a treaty with the Dutch or any other state except by mutual consent. The meaning of this latter clause was that Charles was afraid lest the Dutch, by an alliance with Louis, might become supreme at sea, and that Louis dreaded an alliance of England and the Republic against himself. Danby, though he took part in the negotiation, utterly refused to sign it, declaring that his head would not be safe. The king was obliged to write out and sign the treaty with his own hands. The dishonesty of this transaction was flagrant. Ever since his separate peace with the Dutch in 1674, Charles had been posing as an impartial mediator in the great European quarrel, and his representatives, of whom Temple was one, were already at Nijmegen, the town selected for the negotiation. Various causes delayed the arrival of their French colleagues until June 1676. Even then, the conference was not complete. The allies were waiting to see what would be the result of the year's campaign. 5. Campaign of 1676. The fighting of 1676 was more remarkable by sea than by land. The care bestowed on the French navy by Colbert and Lionne, and the inducements to the noblesse to enter the sea service had borne noble fruit. In Duquesne, France had an intrepid and skilful leader. In 1675 he had beaten the Spaniards at Messina, and had since been riding triumphant in the Mediterranean. At length a greater adversary, Ruyter, with a powerful Dutch fleet, appeared. Duquesne undauntedly faced the renowned sea king. On January 8th and April 22nd, 1676, he fought two fierce but indecisive contests. The latter, however, brought upon the Dutch irremediable disaster. Ruyter, the saviour of the Republic, even more to it than Turenne had been to France, was slain, and he left no one to take his place. With him passed away the last of the great antagonists with whose names we have become familiar: Turenne and Conde, Tromp and Ruyter, Monk and Rupert, Lionne and De Witt. All have gone, and those who have taken their places are smaller men. In June, Duquesne again attacked the Dutch and Spanish fleets in the Bay of Palermo, and this time won a complete victory. The French remained masters of Sicily. On land, May 1676, Louis, with the aid of Vauban, captured the towns of Conde and Bouchain. He then returned to Saint-Germain, leaving Schomberg in Flanders and Luxembourg in Alsace. The latter, however, was unable to prevent the Imperialists from laying siege to Philipsburg. Almost everyone now desired peace. The Republic was exhausted, the death of Ruyter had caused deep discouragement, and there was bad blood between the Dutch and the Spaniards, that cursed race, as William did not hesitate to call them. The failure of William in July to capture Maastricht on the one side, and the failure of Louis to preserve Philipsburg, September 8th, on the other, joined to the rising tide of passion in England, all tended to strengthen the peace influences. Louis now offered to William for a separate peace terms which appealed at once to his personal and national pride. He was to have the sovereignty of Maastricht and Limburg. The southern boundary of the United Provinces was to be moved so that, starting at Ostend and passing by Ghent to Maastricht, it should include Antwerp. Safeguards were to be given against future attack, and William was to be supported by France in extending his authority over the Republic. For a while, but only for a while, William wavered in his loyalty to his allies. He then uncompromisingly declined the proposals. The coalition against Louis was anticipating decisive successes in the next campaign, though the Congress at Nijmegen was sitting. A great council had been called at Wesel to arrange the plan of campaign, for which vast preparations were being made. But that upon which they most rested their hopes was the English Parliament. 6. The War and Parliament, 1677. Necessity had again brought Charles, February 25th, 1677, to face the Commons. So low had his credit sunk that he had been unable to raise a loan in London, while Danby promised him that if he would break with France, supplies far exceeding what Louis could offer would be forthcoming. Louis could only take all the precautions in his power. By an ordinance forbidding the seizure of English vessels, which the Dutch, to evade the liabilities of war, were employing to carry their goods, he conciliated, on the eve of the session, the goodwill of the London merchants, whose influence was vast and whose opposition had been passionate. He sent to Courtin, the new French ambassador at London, £80,000 for bribery, and he renewed his alliance with the Whig lords, James and the Nonconformists, to oppose Danby and secure a dissolution. Courtin was ordered to give Charles no rest. Every day he was at Whitehall, and he never left the court until 11 at night. Well might Charles declare that he was like a besieged place. A blunder of the Whigs gave Danby at the outset a great advantage. Resting their case upon a statute of Edward III, which prescribed annual parliaments, they maintained that by the prorogation for 15 months the present House had ceased to exist. It was easily shown that the statute did not apply, and that it had been virtually repealed by the Triennial Act. In the Commons, the motion raised vehement opposition for the old reasons. The enemies of Danby appeared now as the enemies of Parliament too. The result was an immediate triumph for the minister. The Lords declared that Buckingham, Shaftesbury, Salisbury, and Wharton, the chief movers, must ask pardon of the House. On their refusal they were sent to the Tower, and were thus excluded for the time from influencing the course of affairs. Danby at once took advantage of this momentary eddy in the political current. With the help of all the moderate men, he carried an unconditional vote for £600,000. He next, to quiet the anti-Catholic feeling, brought in a bill for better securing the Protestant religion in case of a Catholic succession. Drastic as its provisions were, the mere fact that it appeared to sanction a Catholic succession was enough to cause it to be regarded as a bill for the protection of Popery, and as such to awake so much jealousy that it never passed its second reading in the Commons. Besides, feeling was at the moment turned into its old channel by the alarming progress of Louis, who during March and April had stormed Valenciennes, the strongest fortress on the Scheldt, and captured Cambrai and Saint-Omer, while his brother, the Duke of Orleans, had inflicted upon William, who had marched to relieve Saint-Omer, a disastrous defeat at Kessel on April 11th. Louis's ally, Charles XI of Sweden, had in the previous December gained a great victory over Christian V of Denmark at Lunden. Parliament was deeply moved by these tidings. A unanimous address was at once sent by both houses to the king, praying for the recall of the English troops serving with France. A second address on March 26th, repeated on April 5th, urged him to declare war against France, with offers of unlimited support. As Courtin informed Louis, the English would give everything for a war with France, even to their shirts. Charles was far from sharing their sentiments. To him, every defeat of William was grateful, not only as bringing peace nearer, but as weakening the prince's dangerous influence. But indomitable under defeat, William was as far from yielding as ever. His personal ascendancy had compelled the support of the States General. He had reorganized his army after the rout of Kessel. In July he marched with 50,000 men upon Charleroi, hoping to be joined by the Duke of Lorraine, and intending after its capture to advance right into France. On August 6th he was before the town, but he had not yet served his apprenticeship in misfortune. The French were vigilant and active as ever. Louvois, the greatest quartermaster ever known, flew to Lille. Luxembourg got to William's rear, and so threatened him that he had to raise the siege and repass the Sambre with nothing but the recapture of Link to show for his labour and loss. The Duke of Lorraine had fared yet worse at the hands of Crequi. Leaving a strong force to oppose the Duke of Saxe-Eisenach, who had crossed by Philippsburg into Alsace, this great pupil of Turenne so harassed Lorraine by skilful manoeuvring and vehement attack that from Mouzon he drove him back upon the Rhine. Still following, he placed himself between his enemy and Alsace. Leaving him a while, he turned upon Saxe-Eisenach, forced him to take refuge on an island on the Rhine, and there to capitulate. Without delay he returned upon Lorraine, who had placed his troops in winter quarters, passed the Rhine on November 8th, and before the Duke could move, invested and captured the coveted post of Freiburg. D'Humieres, between the sea and the Scheldt, had taken Saint-Guillain, and Louis, after a campaign to which the allies had looked as decisive, saw his arms everywhere triumphant. William's position became continually more difficult. He was now the mark for universal abuse. Never, it was said, had there been a commander who had lost so many battles and failed in so many sieges. The foreign officers in the Dutch service contemptuously threw up their commissions. The peace party in the Republic was daily becoming more confident, and he thought it best not to appear at the Hague. His position was now saved by Louis himself. The Dutch were indeed anxious for peace, but no peace would be grateful which did not secure their great interest, commerce. Louis was asked if he would grant the repeal of all the hostile tariffs since 1662 and a satisfactory barrier to the Spanish Low Countries. He refused. Negotiations at once ceased. The States General voted a large increase of the army. They withdrew a demand that they had made upon William for an account of the supplies previously given. Still more important was it that when he announced an intention of visiting Charles at London, they gave him full powers to treat in the name of the Republic. When Parliament reassembled after a short adjournment on May 31st, 1677, the Commons at once declared, in answer to the King's demand for money to secure his alliances, that they would give no money for alliances which were not first placed before them. This was a new departure of a most serious kind. Foreign alliances, beyond everything else, had hitherto been regarded as the prerogative of the Crown, and Parliament, while exercising much influence upon them, had made no direct assertion of right. For Charles to give way would have been to confess his utter defeat in the running fight for the prerogative, which is so important a factor of the history of the reign. He refused to entertain the claim for a moment, and ordered the Houses to adjourn themselves, giving them to understand that they would not sit until winter. But this adjournment left him penniless and perplexed. Money must be got somehow. There were two ways of obtaining it from Parliament: by securing a peace on the Continent satisfactory to the Allies, or by declaring war against France. His efforts in the former direction soon proved abortive, for since the triumphs of the last campaign, Louis was less than ever disposed to be moderate. But Charles refused to yield to Danby's pressure to declare war against France. He could use the English feeling to more profit than by embarking in a struggle which would simply place him more and more in dependence on Parliament. He had simply to take another step on the familiar road, for so long as the war lasted and the temper of Parliament remained the same, he had an article saleable to France. Danby, when overruled on the main question, proved himself a firm and audacious bargain driver. He demanded from Louis, July 1677, £1,600,000. For this he promised that Parliament should not meet until May 1678, and that to discourage the Allies they should be informed of his intention. Charles was thus able to carry on the ordinary expenses of government, and Louis gained the prospect of 9 months' freedom from English interference in the negotiations at Nimwegen. End of section 28. Section 29 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmund Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 22. The Peace of Nimwegen, Part 1. 1. Marriage of William and Mary. Effect on English policy. It was at this moment that William came to England on Charles's invitation. In spite of the fact that nothing could be less in keeping with the latter's engagements to Louis, the time seemed opportune for reviving the scheme of the prince's marriage with Mary. Charles hoped that William would feel the interests of the crown to be directly his own, and would thus be led to support them against his present friends among the Whigs. James believed that the marriage would disarm the violence of the opposition to his own accession, which, as the anti-Catholic spirit rose, was daily becoming keener, by enabling men to look past himself to a Protestant consort of the future queen. William felt that the close connection with the English royal house must strengthen him against both his foreign and domestic troubles, besides giving him a hold upon English foreign policy. The wooing was therefore a short one, especially as it was advisable to give Louis no time for remonstrance. On November 3rd, bonfires were blazing in the streets of London in honour of the betrothal, and on the 15th the marriage took place. The new influence was at once felt. The feeble resolutions of Charles were shaped by the firm will of the younger man, and on November 22nd fresh conditions of peace, which had emanated directly from William, were secretly proposed to Louis. Of all his conquests, Franche-Comté alone, with Cambrai, Aire, and Saint-Omer, were to remain in his hands. The fortifications of Philipsburg were to be razed. The Duke of Lorraine was to be restored to the full possession of his estates. Vague promises were made to satisfy Louis's ally Sweden, and he was to retain Messina until that was done. It was not to be expected that Louis, in the very flush of his triumph, should accept terms which would rob him of the north-eastern frontier, which had so long been the object of French ambition. Rather than that, he wrote to Courton, I would risk losing my own towns if my enemies, which is not likely, were in a condition to conquer them. Danby and William at once made capital of this refusal. Charles's irritation at his fresh failure was carefully fostered, and he was easily persuaded to throw over his compact with France and summon Parliament in January. Before it met, Louis made a last effort. He offered an increased bribe to Charles and a large present to Danby, and he withdrew from his haughty attitude so far as to give up his demand for Luxembourg, Courtrai, and Ypres. Both bribes and offers were, through Danby's steady conduct, refused. Not only so, but on January 10th, 1678, a treaty was signed at The Hague embodying William's terms and binding England and the Republic to compel the assent of both France and Spain. Ostend was handed over to Charles provisionally as a place d'armes on the continent. He raised 12,000 men, ordered the equipment of 30 ships, and recalled his troops in the French service. On February 7th, confident of the concurrence of Parliament, he opened the session with a speech which meant war with France, and he demanded supplies for 90 ships and 40,000 men. But the Shaftesbury opposition utterly distrusted the honesty of Charles's purpose. The marriage of William, as brought about by Danby, was now regarded with suspicion. They affected to believe that it was the result of an agreement with Louis himself, and that the king's warlike language was merely to induce Parliament to give him an army, which he would straightway use to secure despotic power. The welfare of Protestantism abroad and the checking of Louis's aggression no longer occupied their thoughts. To overthrow Danby and to secure liberty of conscience for Protestant dissent at home were their sole objects, and for these they were ready now to render Louis free of all interference from Charles. In fact, since Danby joined William, they joined Louis. Unable to oppose openly a war of which they had been the most vehement advocates, they determined to insist upon conditions of peace so onerous that Louis would be justified in continuing the war, but if possible to render Charles powerless to join it. In the first part of their plan they succeeded. They carried an address to the king demanding that France should be reduced to the terms of the Peace of the Pyrenees, and that no commercial relations should be held with her by England or England's allies until that was done. But farther than this they could not make head against Danby's pensioners and the moderate men. By a large majority it was voted that 30,000 men and 90 vessels should be raised to support the alliance with the Dutch, and on February 18th a resolution to raise £1,000,000 sterling to enable His Majesty to enter into an actual war with the French king was agreed to. 2. Capture of Ghent and Ypres by Louis. Proposals for a separate peace with the Dutch. The suspicions of Charles's honesty were as usual well-founded. Unable from habit, even if willing, to take a great resolution, though one in which the whole nation would have supported him, the king now secretly made a fresh attempt to accommodate matters with Louis by offering the alliance of England for £600,000 on condition that Louis would give up Valenciennes and his other conquests on the Scheldt. But Louis was less than ever disposed to yield, for he had just struck another unexpected blow. He was determined to extort peace, as De Witt had extorted it by the Chatham exploit. Sending Crequi across the Rhine to oppose the Germans, he ostentatiously made preparations which seemed to threaten Ypres, Mons, Namur, and Luxembourg. The Spaniards hurriedly drew troops for their defence from all the towns where no attack was anticipated, among them the great city of Ghent. Suddenly Louis concentrated his forces and appeared before Ghent on March 4th, having previously ordered D'Humieres to meet him there with his corps. Denuded of its defenders, Ghent was in his hands by the 12th. Repeating his stratagem, he threatened Bruges, and when the troops from Ypres were drawn off to its succour, he invested and took that fortress on the 25th. The effect upon public feeling in England was such that Charles, to keep his people within bounds, was obliged to send troops to Ostend, while privately assuring the French ambassador that he had no desire for war, and would do all in his power to avoid it. He was in a pitiable state of perplexity. Afraid of the popular outcry, but unwilling to commit himself to war, he went on with his vain endeavours to find a compromise satisfactory both to Louis and William. His difficulties were increased by the state of things in the United Provinces. There, too, the union of William with the English royal family was looked upon with the keenest suspicion, which was further increased by the discovery of a secret article in the Treaty of January, binding Charles and the States General to assist each other against their rebellious subjects, a discovery which prevented the ratification of the treaty. Upon the Republic, therefore, the capture of Ghent and Ypres had the effect which Louis had intended. Now that their own independence was beyond question, and that he declared himself willing to satisfy one of their essential demands by abandoning to Spain a strong barrier for her Low Countries, the Dutch thought only of their other great interest, commerce, which was every day passing into the hands of England. The States General represented to William the necessity of a separate peace, and they went the length of disbanding a third of their army. Louis, informed of this disposition, at once furnished his deputies at Nimwegen with instructions. Always scrupulously faithful to his allies, he, in the first place, insisted on full satisfaction to Sweden. Of his conquests in the Empire he would retain only Freiburg or Philipsburg. In other respects the Peace of Westphalia should be scrupulously observed. To Spain he would concede a barrier extending from the sea to the Meuse, guarded by Nieuport, Dixmude, Courtrai, Oudenarde, Ath, Mons, Charleroi, and Namur, retaining Ypres in his own hands. To the Dutch he offered Maastricht and the most favourable commercial relations. Partial restoration was promised to the Duke of Lorraine. If these terms were promptly accepted, he would throw in either Charlemont or Dinant and Bouvines. A violent conflict went on in the provinces. Led by Amsterdam and the principal towns of North Holland, the merchants clamoured for peace. Against them were Temple and William, who were supported by the whole body of nobles. The prince hurried to the Hague and spoke vehemently against so shameful an abandonment of his allies. In the end, all that the peace party could do was to secure from Louis a 3 months' truce, with a removal of commercial restrictions and the sending of a pacific mission to England and Brussels. Meanwhile the news of their action had reached England. Charles evidently saw in it an excuse for withdrawing from his forced connection with the Republic. He laid the matter before Parliament, April 29th, in a tone of anger at such a step having been taken without his consent, and requested its advice. At the desire of the Commons he placed before them the various treaties he had mentioned in his speech. After several days of eager debate, a resolution of the most uncompromising character was carried by a narrow majority. The king was desired at once to join the coalition for carrying on the war, to secure the continued co-operation of the Republic, to obtain the consent of all the allies to a total prohibition of any commercial relations with France, to invite further assistance, and to secure a promise that no peace should be made without the consent of all. To this vote, so different from what he had desired, Charles made no reply, on the ground that the Lords had not concurred. But on May 11th he sent a message warning the Commons that unless a supply were speedily given him, he should be forced to lay up his ships and disband his troops, the very step to which the Shaftesbury party, in fulfilment of their pledge to Louis, were now bent upon driving him. The message raised a tempest in the House. As Colonel Birch said, "This is a work of darkness from the beginning." But so well had Danby marshalled his forces that the court secured a majority of 1 against continuing the discussion. He was unable, however, to prevent a general resolution against the whole conduct of affairs, praying especially for the removal of Lauderdale and other evil counsellors. Charles at once prorogued the Parliament for 10 days. 3. Secret treaties of Charles with Louis, the disbanding question in Parliament. The truce offered by Louis with the suggested terms of peace had in the meantime been submitted to the other members of the coalition. By one and all they were rejected in language of the utmost defiance. Louis therefore again set himself to secure a separate peace with the Republic, but he lost no opportunity for strengthening his own position. Assembling a strong force at Courtrai on May 16th, he crossed the Lys, and from the little town of Daintz, close to Ghent, wrote a conciliatory letter to the States General. For a time William, supported by the nobles, and now by some of the towns, though not by Amsterdam, stood firm against any compromise. His resolution, however, was changed by unfavourable news from England, and he consented to a deputation being sent to confer with Louis. The belief of Birch that the whole matter was a work of darkness was fully justified. Charles had been again in secret negotiation with Louis, who had offered him £240,000 in the course of 3 years should he succeed in bringing about a peace. But Danby, who was determined that if England was to be at the back of France it should be for a good price, demanded that sum yearly for 3 years, the payment to begin at once. Louis decided to meet Charles halfway. On May 27th, by a secret agreement drawn up and signed by Charles alone, for Danby again refused to put his head in peril by adding his name, it was arranged that Charles should do his best to secure peace on terms favourable to Louis within 2 months, that if unsuccessful he should recall and disband his troops, except 3,000 to be left in Ostend, and should prorogue Parliament for 4 months on condition of receiving the subsidy demanded, half of which was to be paid at the expiration of the 2 months. The suspicions of the Commons again tended to reduce Charles to the powerlessness which Louis desired. On the very day of the compact, May 27th, they demanded either immediate war with France or immediate disbanding. A week later, after 2 similar votes, they insisted that the disbanding should take place by the end of June, though they afterwards altered the date as regarded the forces in the Spanish Low Countries to July 27th, and they provided money for the purpose. They gave him, too, a further supply for other uses, after rejecting without a division his request for an increase of £300,000 to the revenue. When, however, the Lords endeavoured to extend the date, they at once repelled the assumed right of the Upper House to meddle with a bill of money, by tacking the bill to raise funds for disbanding onto that for further supply, so that they must both fall or pass together. Charles, having passed the bill, prorogued the Parliament on July 15th. He had an excuse more than sufficient in his eyes for evading the engagement to disband, for the whole aspect of affairs abroad, and with it his intentions, had again undergone a complete change. Up to the end of June, peace with the Dutch and Spain had seemed assured. William himself regarded it as useless to struggle any longer against the universal cry. He wrote a conciliatory letter to Louis, which was answered in the tone befitting an injured father to a repentant son. The States General ordered their deputies to sign the treaty before the end of the month, and Spain expressed her concurrence. Only at the last moment a misunderstanding suddenly declared itself, which threatened an immediate renewal of the war on the part of every nation engaged. End of section 29. Section 30 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmund Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 22. The Peace of Nimwegen, Part 2. 4. Expected renewal of war. Another treaty of England with the Dutch. Separate peace between Louis and the Dutch. In promising to give back to Spain the towns which were to form her barrier, Louis had avoided pledging himself to do so as a preliminary to peace, though this was understood by the Dutch and the Spaniards. He now demurred to giving them up until the demands of Sweden should be satisfied. This would have compelled the Dutch to maintain a large army on the Yssel, when their greatest desire was to disband. In a moment the provinces were in a blaze, and William regained his ascendancy. Though everyone now longed for peace, the fortunes of war had been so evenly balanced that any unexpected pretension, on one side or the other, was sufficient to throw all into confusion. Charles underwent the same revulsion of feeling. He refused to ratify his secret treaty with Louis, or to disband his troops in the Spanish Low Countries, declaring that his people would chase him from his kingdom if Louis were suffered to extend his conquests. He sent off Temple once more, July 6th, in haste to make a strict alliance with the Republic, and on July 26th a treaty was framed binding the Dutch to continue the struggle and England to declare war if Louis by August 11th did not declare himself ready to give up the town at once. Louis had thus 15 days wherein to settle the question upon which depended the breaking up of the coalition or the immediate renewal of war. Day by day the interval passed without an answer from Louis. He could not bring himself to break through his rule of fidelity to his alliances. At length he was set free by the action of the Swedes themselves. One of their deputies took upon himself to declare that Sweden would raise no objection to a separate peace if the Republic promised not to assist her foes. Louis thereupon ordered the treaty to be signed, on condition that Spain should make a similar engagement regarding both himself and his allies. This demand led to further delay, and on the 9th, within a day of the stipulated time, all was still in doubt. When at 10 on the next morning they met for the last conference, the French commissioners Colbert, Estrades, and Avaux felt how vast were the issues depending upon that day's work. Carefully as the exhaustion of France was kept from the knowledge of Europe, they knew that the continuation of war would be a terrible calamity for their country, and that Louis, haughty as might be his language, had probably reached the limits of what it was possible for him to conquer at the time. They knew, too, that Temple had arrived the evening before at Nimwegen to frustrate, if possible, in concert with William, the conclusion of peace. For 13 hours the conference sat continuously. Colbert and his colleagues fought the ground inch by inch against the settled will of William and the States General. Only 1 hour before the moment at which negotiations would cease, at 11, on the night of August 10th, 1678, France and the Republic signed the treaty which removed the most important member from the coalition and gave the signal for its disruption. By this treaty Louis confessed afresh the complete failure of his war of aggression on the Dutch. The patient Republic came out of the 6 years' struggle without the loss of an acre of land. The sum of her concessions was a promise of neutrality during the remainder of the war. Untouched in their territory, the Dutch were also secured in their main interest, commerce. Freedom of trade and navigation were mutually restored, and the compulsory visitation of the warships of either nation in each other's harbours removed, while all vexatious restrictions on Dutch subjects residing or trading in France were taken off. Each might henceforth trade with the enemies of the other, if properly provided with a passport, except in articles contraband of war, or in the language of international law. A free ship was to cover the merchandise, but all goods on an enemy's ship should be liable to confiscation. The personal interests of William were provided for by the restoration of his Principality of Orange, and of all the estates belonging to him in France, Franche-Comté, the Charolais, and the Spanish Low Countries. Spain and any other of the allies who within 6 weeks from the ratification should declare themselves ready to accept peace were to be admitted as parties to the treaty. Strange to say, the peace was signalized by the most desperate engagement of the war. William, with all the forces he could collect, had marched to succour Mons, then invested by the Duke of Luxembourg. On August 14th he arrived before the French lines. Luxembourg knew that peace was concluded. William had certainly no official knowledge, but the probability of events must be set against his emphatic declaration, that he had no information whatever. He determined to strike one more blow at Louis, and, if possible, to destroy his own unbroken record of defeat in the field. By an impetuous attack upon Luxemburg's lines, he for a while carried all before him. But the hunchbacked dwarf rallied his forces and delivered so fierce a counterstroke that after 6 hours of murderous conflict he regained the captured positions. At the close of a long day of slaughter, Luxemburg still held Mons in his grip, while William, though he had failed in his main object, remained on the field of battle. The next morning the official declaration of peace arrived, and at the same hour by arrangement the two armies left Mons, the French retreating toward Ath, the Dutch to Brussels. 5. Peace with Spain. The treaty was not binding until it had been ratified. To prevent this ratification, William and Temple strained every nerve. They were supported by the indignant reproaches of the allies whom the Republic had thus deserted: Denmark, Brandenburg, the Emperor, and the Bishop of Munster. Spain too put obstacles in the way. The States General hereupon adjourned the ratification until the peace with Spain was signed, acting meanwhile as mediators. But the internal troubles of Spain robbed her of all real desire to continue the war. The boy king, Charles II, had assumed the government at the age of 14 on November 6, 1675, but the power remained with the Queen Regent. She in turn delivered it into the hands of Fernando Valenzuela, a worthless favourite of the type of Piers Gaveston or Robert Carr. A rise of the nobles took place in consequence, and the king's natural brother Don John came into power, though Charles remained nominally king. The favourite was banished, and the queen fled. Don John, in turn, soon found himself in the midst of difficulties, and was anxious to be free from the additional complications of the war. Louis, informed of the activity of the emissaries of William, who were inveighing in every town of the province of Holland against the dishonour brought upon the nation, and of the mission of Lawrence Hyde from the King of England, with an engagement to declare war 3 days after he knew that the States General had refused to ratify the treaty, determined with his usual good sense not to endanger the advantages he had acquired. On September 17th the peace was signed with Spain. France gave back Charleroi, Binche, Ath, Oudenarde, and Courtrai, which she had gained by the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle. The town and duchy of Limburg, all the country beyond the Meuse, Ghent, Rodenhuis, and the district of the Vèze, Leuze, and Saint-Ghislain, with Puig-Cerdà in Catalonia, these having been taken since that peace. But she retained Franche-Comté, with the towns of Valenciennes, Bouchain, Condé, Cambrai, and the Cambrésis, Aire, Saint-Omer, Ypres, Veuvic, Warneton, Poperinge, Bailleul, Kessel, Bavaille, and Maubeuge. The signature of this treaty was followed by the ratification of that with the Dutch. The Spaniards, however, with their ingrained love of delay, attempted, when the date came, October 31st, for the ratification of their own treaty, to put it off until that with the Emperor was signed. Louis held his hand for a month, then, thoroughly provoked, he ordered his troops to march upon Brussels. This brought the Spaniards to their senses, and on December 15th the ratifications were exchanged. 6. Peace with the Emperor and the rest of the allies. There remained the Grand Elector of Brandenburg and the King of Denmark, the Dukes of Brunswick and Lüneburg, the Bishop of Munster, and the Emperor. The two first, whose operations were chiefly against Sweden, at the point farthest from Louis, and who were gaining successes there, did their best, though now deprived of the subsidies of the United Provinces, to prevent the Emperor from coming to terms with France and Sweden. He, however, had conclusive reasons for wishing to make peace. He had in the last campaign seen the young Duke of Lorraine thoroughly beaten by Crequi, who, besides preventing the capture of Freiberg, had taken Kehl, Ruppelschau, Landau, and Lichtenberg, and had destroyed the bridge at Strasbourg. The Hungarians, too, had risen against him, and with the support of bodies of troops raised in Poland and officered by Frenchmen, had gained alarming successes on the border. On February 2nd, 1679, peace was declared between Louis, the Emperor, and the Empire. Louis gave back Philippsburg, retaining Freiburg with the desired liberty of passage across the Rhine to Breisach. In all other respects, the Treaty of Münster, October 24, 1648, was re-established. If the enemies of Sweden would not make peace, the Emperor and the Empire would neither assist them nor allow them to encamp on the territory of the Empire outside their own dominions, while Louis should be free to keep garrisons in several towns of the Empire. The treaty then dealt with the Duke of Lorraine. To his restoration, Louis annexed conditions which rendered Lorraine little more than a French province. Not only was Nancy to become French, but in conformity with the Treaty of 1661, Louis was to have possession of 4 large roads traversing the country, with half a league's breadth of territory throughout their length, and the places contained therein, the roads namely from Saint-Dizier to Nancy, and from Nancy to Alsace, Vesoul in Franche-Comté, and Metz. The town and district of Longwy also were to be placed in his hands. To these conditions the Duke refused to subscribe, preferring continual exile until the Peace of Ryswick in 1697, when at length his son regained the ancestral estates. On the same day the Emperor and the Empire made peace with Sweden. All that the Allies had taken from her was to be restored, and the Emperor agreed to mediate between her and the powers that still stood out. It was impossible for the other members of the coalition to carry on the war. The Dukes of Brunswick and Lüneburg, the Bishop of Münster, surrendered their captures in Sweden, retaining 1 or 2 places which rectified their frontiers. Each received from Louis a subsidy for the concession. It needed, however, a final exhibition of force before Brandenburg and Denmark would give way. Créqui again passed the Rhine and took Mark and Lippstadt, then crossed the Weser, defeated the Grand Elector, and threatened Magdeburg. On June 29th, the Grand Elector consented to make restitution to Sweden, except on the Brandenburg side of the Oder, promising to build no fortress on that river. Denmark, left alone, made peace with France and Sweden in September on similar terms, and separate treaties were also concluded between Sweden, Spain, and the Republic. The Dutch, who in accordance with the Treaty of 1673 should have restored Maastricht to Spain, retained that important bulwark as a recompense for their efforts in securing the barrier for the latter country. 7. Conclusion. The effect of the Peace of Nimwegen was, thus speaking generally, to reaffirm the Peace of Westphalia. But inasmuch as Louis, though foiled in the immediate purpose of the war, was the only gainer, it did not, like the Peace of Westphalia, close for any length of time the sources of strife, but while affording to France a basis for future aggrandizement, left sore feelings everywhere, with the certainty of renewal of war. One country alone, or rather one person, had come out of the struggle with marked discredit. The position of Charles II of England was indeed contemptible. Peace had been made without his concurrence, in spite indeed of his utmost efforts. He had lived by chicanery, and his chicanery had ended in complete discomfiture. Louis, now neither needing nor fearing him, met his appeal for part at least of the money he claimed with a contemptuous refusal. In December 1678 the Lords united with the Commons in insisting on his immediately disbanding his troops, and from that moment, baffled in diplomacy and crippled for war, he had no further voice in continental affairs. His position with his own people was as humiliating as his position in the face of Europe. To the Parliament and to the Church he was an object of suspicion. His supplies were doled out with jealous parsimony, and his use of the money was vigilantly watched. From the control under which he fretted, his only chances of escape had been trickery and foreign alms. His servants were indeed capable, but bitter personal rivalries prevented all co-operation, and though the extravagances of an opposition as unscrupulous as himself, aided by his own coolness of head and cynical good temper, afforded him before long an opportunity for establishing an apparently complete ascendancy in his kingdom, it was an ascendancy maintained only by a scrupulous observance of conditions which he had now for 19 years in vain endeavoured to evade. The picture is heightened by contrast. Louis stood before Europe upon a pinnacle of glory. How he had used the instruments of ambition by which he found himself surrounded at the close of the wars of the Fronde, the renowned commanders, the veteran troops, the skilful diplomatists, the great administrators, among whom he stood the adored and unquestioned chief, how, with a people contented to be at length freed from the desolation of civil war, and a treasury soon overflowing through the genius of Colbert, he had leaped at 2 bounds to a position which made him at once the admiration and the terror of Europe, how he had created navies and had sent out his armies north, south, and east to confront all Europe in arms, how he had defeated coalitions, dictated treaties of peace, pensioned kings and governments, how he had not only baffled the jealousy of England, but had even enlisted the might of her crown in support of aggressions which her people hated, all this we have seen. And like that of Charles, his European position was reflected in that which he held at home. To his own people he was as a god. His marshals and his armies knew no will but his word. His ambassadors in every court carried out his commands with unfailing obedience. After 20 years of imperial almsgiving and of war, his treasury, still to ordinary observers, seemed overflowing. To such purpose had he depressed the haughty noblesse of France, that they who had been the rivals of the throne were now content to worship from the level of a common servitude. All great offices, the names of which recalled the days when the monarchy was still under restraint, constable, admiral, and lieutenant general, were suppressed, and the rest he took so literally into his own hands that in 1681 he put them up to public auction. With the aid of the Jesuits he defied the papacy, and over the church his rule was absolute. For every form of intellectual effort France was then famous: religious oratory, science, art, history, literature, and one and all were devoted to the glorification of the king. And yet, at this very time, there was not far distant the happy combination of events which was to place a final check to his ambition. In the breast of William of Orange there glowed ever more intensely that unquenchable hatred of France, which had received its last and fiercest expression in the desperate onset upon Luxemburg's lines before Mons. Within 10 years he once more arrayed Europe for the conflict, but this time with a mightier following at his back. England at length took her rightful place. The man who in his own person represented the spirit of continental opposition to the aggressions of Louis, and the opposition of the English people to the French and Popish policy of their own kings, found himself enabled to let loose the hatred which, thwarted so long, had grown ever keener by repression. The happiest day of William's life was probably that on which, as King of England, he declared war against France. On that day began the long and terrible course of retributive humiliations, which at length struck his lifelong antagonist to her knees, and brought upon the great monarch an old age embittered by disappointment and care. End of section 30. Recording by Pamela Nagami in Encino, California, July 2018. End of the English Restoration and Louis XIV, from the Peace of Westphalia to the Peace of Nimwegen by Osmund Airy.